Again, you've joined us in the Humanizing class webinar series for the session, The Dark Fantastic, Race and Imagination in Youth Literature, Media, and Culture. I'm pleased to be joined by our lead scholar tonight, Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, who is at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm also very pleased to welcome back Jen Ansbach, who was a member of our TAC last year. Jen's going to be our TA tonight. Jen has pulled together a really great bibliography that we've added to the resources, and she's going to be dropping her thoughts, questions, and perhaps some links in the chat as we move forward. So, Ebony, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I welcome you to the program. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I hope everyone can hear me.
We can, and in a moment I'm going to turn over the PowerPoint to you. We are fascinated by the cover and what it may imply your book is about, and your session tonight might allude to. I hope you had a chance to see all the wonderful chatter in the audience chat box. But before we get started, I'd actually like to ask you a personal question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So, Professor, tell us a little bit about your earliest interactions with print, with fantasy. Can you remember who read to you? Or can you remember when you first kind of entered into that sort of magical deep well of reading for pleasure when you were a young girl?
Absolutely. My family always had books around, and I was raised in part by my grandparents because my parents were young, both worked. And so I had 4 adults reading to me. Well, really 3 reading because one was legally blind and could not read, my grandfather. But my mother, father, and grandmother read to me. And I was reading by the age of 2. So
Wow.
I took to books like a duck takes to water.
Yeah, I can imagine. So of the people in your family, do you have any memories you associate with a particular book or title or something that just really grabbed you early and you just fell into it?
Well, for picture books, I remember loving The Snowy Day, Ezra Jack Keats, because it was whimsical, right? So I lived in a very snowy place, Detroit, Michigan, and here was this little black boy who was interacting with his environment in ways that I wanted to interact with mine. And so that was probably one of my very earliest memories, that and Blueberries for Sal, because I just thought that was cool.
Yeah, it's just amazing to me still, whether it's the global phenomena of Harry Potter or it's the titles that we don't recognize but we remember from our youth. It's amazing to me how those words, they stick with who we become, right? They really do inform our identity.
Absolutely. I was slightly older when Virginia Hamilton's The People That Fly was first published, so I don't think I read it until I was about 9 years old, but that book also had a profound influence on me.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for sharing that and sort of setting up tonight, which is what I think will be just a reaffirmation of how incredibly powerful and sometimes in a dangerous way that the power of that written word can be for young people. And we're really looking forward to hearing more about your work.
Thanks so much for having me. I want to thank the National Humanities Center for inviting me to share with you this evening. I have given this talk quite a bit, but what's going to be different tonight is that Andy and I are going to engage in conversation, and I sincerely welcome your questions. I've begun turning my attention away from thinking about race in traditional fantasy toward thinking about race in more diverse fantastic worlds. This is quite a time. And so I really would love to engage with you. And I echo everything that Andy said about our colleagues, both in K-12 and in higher education, taking the time to share with each other during such a fraught period in our country's history. And so I just thank you for coming humbly and listening to me today. All right, so we'll get started. I think I have control of the slides now.
You do. There you go.
All right. How many of you recognize the lyrics to this song? Please place any memories or associations that you have with these song lyrics into the chat. If I could sing, I would sing along with Gene Wilder and revisit a fond childhood memory. There is no life I know to compare with pure imagination. Living there, you'll be free if you truly wish to be. Lyrics like this inspire our childhood fantasies through what we read, view, and experience in children's books and media. However, not everyone is positioned the same way inside these realms of pure imagination. Even the author of Charlie's Chocolate Factory himself didn't see all kids as the same, but we will get there in due course. I often share the words of 14-year-old Maud from West Philadelphia. He will appear in my next book, The Shadow Book, because I want to contrast the whimsical lyrics of the previous slide to the perspective that we received from an eighth grader several years ago when my research team and I were embedded in a now closed middle school. Ahmad told us that he wanted to live his life free. We just judged automatically from our brothers and like our family, we just judge. We're judged to be bad and terrible, like young men already. Adultification. We're tagged from being African American and boys at that. So, like, that's two strikes to us already. We didn't want to edit his language. We wanted you to hear his voice. And so, one of my grad students said, "So, how do you want to live your life, Ahmad?" And this young man told us this: "I want to live my life free. Not like I can do whatever I want, but not be judged for I could just go off to college without being judged by the people and looking at my background. Where did I come from? I want to live my life free." I want to live my life free, 14-year-old Ahmad told us so powerfully. Young people like Ahmad in Philadelphia fueled the long and storied career of the late great children's author Walter Dean Myers. Children's literature is critical in the production of freedom for reasons that I think Myers articulated best in an editorial that ran in the New York Times in the spring of 2014, shortly before his untimely death. He began by recounting what a criminal defense attorney once said about his poor, Black, young clients. The trouble, he told Myers, is to humanize my clients in the eyes of a jury, to make them think of this defendant as a human being and not just one of them. And then Myers writes, "I realized that this was exactly what I wanted to do when I wrote about poor inner city children, to make them human in the eyes of readers, and especially in their own eyes. I need them to feel as if they are part of America's dream, that all the rhetoric is meant for them, and that they are wanted in this country." 20 years or after we began the 21st century, this graphic, illustrated by David Huck in consultation with Dr. Sarah Park Dolan, a dear friend of mine at St. Catherine University in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, illustrates statistics from the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The CCBC has analyzed trends in children's publishing on an annual basis for more than 2 decades. They have found that every year, the vast majority of all Children's and young adult books published feature white characters, a statistic that has not moved since the 1960s. This raised public awareness beyond librarianship, education, and publishing. So that's what Walter Dean Myers and his son Christopher Myers editorials did for us in the spring of 2014. Shortly after that, the very influential organization We Need Diverse Books was formed. So I have to admit there's been some movement over the past 5 years when it comes to diversity in children's and young adult literature. Many of you right here in this seminar room have spent countless hours, days, weeks, months, years, and even decades working toward diversity, equity, and justice in the literature curriculum. I commend you for that, colleagues. We're all working so hard on these issues. Unfortunately, we still have quite a way to go. After 21 years of teaching, writing, and interacting online and in various fandoms, I've found a few things to be true about the books that we have on our shelves. One of them is the dire consequences that a person of color or even a character of color faces when he, she, or they step out of their assigned place or flips the script in any discernible way. Another thing that I have found to be true over the years is that essential qualities such as goodness, beauty, innocence, and truth have been so often racialized as white in literature and media for young people that ascribing them to other groups is seen as transgressive, even when white folks are not even part of the conversation, the art, or the representation. Don't believe me? Scroll through some YouTube comments on book trailers. They can be quite stark. So I wrote a book about it a couple of years ago, The Dark Fantastic, Race and the Imagination from Harry Potter to The Hunger Games. In it, I want to think about where we've been in the realm of pure imagination over the past few decades and the pernicious legacies we've inherited from the past. In The Dark Fantastic, I trace a pattern that I found throughout the Anglo-American science fiction and fantasy tradition that traps Black characters into pernicious cycles. Yeah, I'm getting some feedback, so let me pause for a moment. Is everyone muted? I'm wondering. Let's see.
Yeah, everybody is muted, but your audio is getting a little choppy on us, and I've noticed it.
What's going on? How can we shoot if it's getting distracting? How can we fix it, Andy?
Well, let's see if now the audience is muted, so nobody there has an open mic.
Sure.
I can close mine. I hate to say it because it's so frustrating when tech support really comes down to its own fantastic world. It may just be something that the Wi-Fi is, has a little disturbance. If it gets really bad, Professor, then I might ask you to log out and come back in. But I think right now, if my sense is it's going to sort of even itself out.
Okay. Yeah. I apologize, audience. I don't have anything on here except for a heater. So why don't I turn off the heater? There are absolutely no devices here on.
And already you're more clear. So it may have just been one of those weird sort of waves that comes into Wi-Fi broadcasting sometimes.
All right. Thank you. All right. So I will continue. When a Black character appears in the fantastic, it's a spectacle. Wow, why is Rue a little Black girl? That spectacle makes many readers and viewers hesitate. They think, wait, she's Black, but she's innocent. That's not right. This creates a dilemma in the reader or viewer's imagination. Most of the time, this dilemma is reconciled through violence. That violence mirrors the phenomenon of violence toward Black people and others from the margins in the real world who step out of their assumed places. I argue that we can't imagine things differently because we've been carefully taught to accept this kind of injustice in stories from our very earliest experiences. But while the dark other must die, she cannot die. For this part of the cycle, I draw upon Toni Morrison, who talks about the ways that darkness and Black people haunt all of American literature, most notably in Playing in the Dark. So Rue and so many other Black characters haunt these stories even after their deaths. In the book, I show how. Subverting this pernicious treatment of the dark other in the fantastic would require radical rethinking of everything that we know and critically conscious activism in storytelling. It is difficult, under-theorized, and messy work. We're going to get into each of the 5 stages in subsequent slides. Lately, people have been asking me, was the dark fantastic obsolete before you even published it? After all, a year before your book appeared on New York University Press, we had 2 incredible blockbuster, $100 million plus big budget movies that featured characters of color, mainly Black characters, in the kinds of roles that you argued, Dr. Thomas, are absent from the shelf, absent from television and film. So I'll admit the end of the 2010s is very different than the beginning of the decade, and now we're into the 2020s. So after all, as late as March 2012, so let's historicize this bit, as recently as March 2012, there wasn't a single network show on United States television featuring a Black woman lead, not a major primetime network show. The landscape in the post-Black Panther era, one in which Black directors have multi-million-dollar budgets in the world of pure imagination, seems to be one where we have closed the imagination gap, stopped the dark fantastic cycle, and given kids and teens like Ahmad the freedom that they so long for. But is it that simple? And are we giving adults too much credit for what kids, teens, and young adults are already doing to read and write the self into existence in text and media that have traditionally excluded them? Just a thought. Words cannot express how elated I am that it's common knowledge that Hermione is Black in 2015. It's no longer a headcanon. It's a widely accepted interpretation of a character described as brown with a hair texture that's never found outside of the African diaspora. There are hundreds of drawings of Hermione depicted as she was written. People are cosplaying her without being asked why they don't look like Emma Watson. This is so beautiful, and I don't know what started it, if it was a text post, a race-bent fan cast, or people just collectively coming out and saying, hey, I thought that when reading the books too, but I am forever grateful. This Tumblr post, written by University of North Carolina undergraduate Brianna Harvey in 2015, so she's well into her 20s by now, out in the work world, is indicative of the ways that young people today have been reading and writing the self into existence, inscribing diversity into worlds that have heretofore only offered a single story. So I want to begin my dark fantastic cycle with this act of interpretive freedom to set the stage for a major literary crisis of our times that I argue is still happening and happening across infinite fantastic worlds. And I saw someone in chat mention Scandal, and yes, that was exactly what I was referring to. Scandal premiered the next month after March 2012. All right. Humans tell stories to make sense of the world around us. This myth making process forms meta narratives or stories about stories that shape society, culture, and the imagination. As notable fantasist Brian Atterbury observes, fantasy is an arena, I believe the primary arena, in which competing claims about myth can be contested and different relationships with myth tried out. Another notable fantasy theorist, Vera Mendelssohn, further theorizes the relationships between a reader and a fantastic story as rhetorical. The reader can enter a portal and go on a quest, or they can be immediately immersed within the fantastic world from the first page, the first television scene, or the first swell of the movie score. The fantastic can even intrude upon the world the reader knows, or the reader can choose to remain in the liminal space between the real and the unreal. What unites all of these paths into the fantastic is belief. You have to believe the world that you're entering when you're reading a book or you're watching a film or a television show. This is a common theoretical thread we find in both Atterbury and Mendelssohn, and that has its genesis in Todorov's influential The Fantastic, a structural approach to a literary genre, which I read a long time ago as a first year master's student while teaching fifth grade and teaching Harry Potter. He wrote, I nearly reached the point of believing. That is the formula which sums up the spirit of the fantastic. Either total faith or total incredulity would lead us beyond the fantastic. It is hesitation which sustains its life. That point of hesitation, whether it is the first flutter of a dragon's wing, blood dripping from a vampire's fang, the shimmer and glimmer of fairy dust, or an otherworldly glow in a character's eyes, is very familiar to the readers, viewers, and fans of fantasies, fairy tales, and other imaginative works. From our earliest years, we are inclined toward finding that point of hesitation that signals the fantastic. However, not everyone is positioned the same way in or by the fantastic. Although it is generally assumed that audiences are positioned to identify with the heroes and heroines of these stories about stories, the fantastic also shapes our collective consciousness toward perceptions of difference. You see, within the fantastic, a primary location of alterity or difference is embodied darkness. The traditional purpose of darkness in Western cultures has been to disturb, to unsettle, and to cause unrest. This primal fear of darkness and dark others is so deeply rooted in Western myth that it is nearly impossible to find its origin. I know because I tried. I talked to colleagues across the humanities for about 3 years while I was writing the book. It took me 5 years to write. And I said, well, where did this idea, not of, I wasn't interested in the origin of race or racism. I was interested in, why did we decide dark was bad? We heard that a week ago. People kept using, the phrase, this is such a dark day. And they kept saying it over and over, and I kept whispering on my Twitter account. Well, I don't really whisper anywhere, but I kept saying, well, why not bleak? Why not dismal? How about other terms? And so where did it come from? So some scholars told me, well, it comes from ancient Greece and the classical tradition, connotations of light versus dark. While others located a corresponding valuation of whiteness and lighter-skinned people in the Christianization of the late Roman Empire and Dark Ages Europe and in the emergence of the Islamic world. And I'm more inclined to believe that as an origin because there's great work happening right now in critical medieval studies. However, no matter what these reasons were in the past, the consequences in the present have been a nameless and lingering fear of darkness. The mysterious unknowability of darkness in nature was thus extended to a corresponding fear of unknown and unknowable dark things, including imaginary monsters beyond the boundaries of the known world during the medieval period in Europe, and in the modern period, conquered and enslaved people by European kingdoms and later nations. This fear of dark people was written into the United States Constitution at the founding, denoting for the ages, with a 3/5 compromise, that enslaved African Americans were not fully human. The colloquial term by which people of African descent were often known during this late 18th century period, darky, signals that in our modern English, darkness has never been just a metaphor. It's just not a metaphor for night. Even in language, darkness is personified, embodied, and most assuredly racialized. Many of you have heard me talk about this next idea. Rooted in both critical race theory and Afro-pessimism, the central claim that I'm making about the dark fantastic is this, and I'd love to get some of your reactions in chat, which I am reading as I'm giving the lecture. In the Anglo-American fantastic tradition, the dark other is the monstrous thing that tends to be the root cause of hesitation, spectacle, and violence. The dark other is the present absence that lingers at the edges of every fairy tale. She stalks the shadows of the futurist visions of science fiction, lurks along the margins of the imagined magical pasts of high fantasy, and renders the uchronia of alternate history into nonsensical cipher. For me, what's most chilling is that even when many of us who are endarkened and others dream in the fantastic, the dark other is still the obstacle to be overcome. Even in stories where all of the characters are white and blue-eyed, the dark other is always already there. And this is something new that I haven't said. In a recent article for a special issue of The Lion and the Unicorn, I actually applied the dark fantastic cycle to a number of recent young adult speculative texts written by Black authors. And I found the dark fantastic cycle operating there too. Which was one reason why I didn't want to make that argument in the book. We've all read the same set of books, especially those of us who are 30 and over, those of us who are the teachers and professors of this generation. We were all shaped, our imaginations were shaped by what was present and missing on the shelf. Our imaginations were shaped by the landscapes of Hollywood and television shows, comic books, material culture, such as toys. We were all shaped by that. When readers who are white or middle class or cisgender or heterosexual or able-bodied enter the fantastic dream, sometimes they can be empowered and afforded a sense of transcendence that may be elusive within the real world. However, this often means that the implicit message that the readers, hearers, and viewers of color who are also in the audience receive as we read and view and engage with these texts is this: we are the villains, we are the horde, we are the enemies, we are the monsters. So for many readers, viewers, and fans of color, I suspect that at the level of consciousness, to participate in the fantastic is to watch yourself be slain, and justifiably so, as the story recounts. In fairy tales, it was you who terrorized the hapless villagers, who kidnapped the fair princess, who dared wage war against the dashing hero. You are the jealous darker sister who wishes to steal the fair maiden's pedestal for yourself. Because you're less classically beautiful. Yeah. If you're present in the story at all, you're relegated to the margins. To watch a science fiction film that's not Star Trek is to learn that you have no future. There are usually only 2 or 3 people of color on most fictional spaceships. And as some of my wonderful colleagues who study colorism have pointed out, even in some of the shows we laud, colorism and how dark the characters get to be is a persistent problem. Very often when you do appear on the page or on the screen, you don't have much agency in the narrative. You're enslaved, you're a servant, you're a prostitute, but one-dimensional. Even your very body is not your own. It's in service to a protagonist who is not a person of color. If you have words, your speech serves only to support the narrative, never to subvert it. Rarely is the narrative focalized through your eyes. You're rendered abject, fungible, and socially dead. You're the alien other. You're Tolkien's orc. You are the fell beast. The very presence of the dark other in a text of speculative fiction across genre and mode creates a profound ontological dilemma. This dilemma is inescapable for readers and for writers and must be reconciled. I argue that this is most often resolved by enacting narrative violence against the dark other. This is what the readers and hearers of the fantastic expect, for it mirrors the unending spectacle of violence against the endarkened and the othered in our own world. The fantastic has need of darkness, for these innocent stories about stories require both heroes and villains, fair princesses and evil crones, valiant steeds and nightmarish beasts. The fantastic requires all kinds of monsters, Medusas and Grendels, chimeras and manticores, cunning tricksters and cowardly fools. It needs the dark other as its source of hesitation, the very spectacle that causes the heart to skip in fear. It desires the dark other's violent in a form of ritual sacrifice, purging the very source of the darkness and righting the wrongs of the world before returning to haunt the happy ending. Let's get into the actual principles, stages, steps. I kept changing what I wanted to call this pattern that I noticed. So the first principle of the dark fantastic is that of spectacle. Even in 2021, audiences marvel at the presence of a dark-skinned protagonist, particularly in spreadable media. That term's from Henry Jenkins. So thinking about books that aren't just specifically marketed to diverse audiences, the stuff that everybody watches and talks about. People marvel at it still. In a world structured by the twin axioms of white superiority and black inferiority, of white existence and black non-existence, in a world structured by a negative categorical imperative, above all, don't be black. In this world, the 0 degree of world transformation is the turn toward blackness, a turn toward the shame, as it were, that resides in the idea of I am thought of as less than human. The 3 black girl characters that I focus on in the dark fantastic are Bonnie in the Vampire Diaries, Rue in the Hunger Games, and Gwen and Merlin. In the book description, I say that I focused on Angelina Johnson in Harry Potter, but I wrote fan fiction about her a long, long time ago, and I just talk about the aftermath of my time in that fandom. So each of these 3 girls get their own chapter. While Bonnie and Rue both have their origins in popular young adult fiction novels that predate the current Afrofuturistic Renaissance, Gwen is a recent reimagining of young Queen Guinevere from the Arthurian legends. While Bonnie and Gwen were originally white in their source texts, Rue was not, but was famously read that way by many readers. In my analyses, I find that once a text is transmediated, that is adapted for smaller large screens, and non-traditional casting results in a dark-skinned actress playing a fantastic role, the result is visual spectacle, a signal that this is not like the usual story. The second principle of the dark fantastic cycle is that of hesitation. The very presence of the dark other interrupts the waking dream of the fantastic. This creates a dilemma for readers, but also for creators. Although the dark other is necessary for the fantastic, her presence is unsettling. She's not supposed to be there, although she must be, wreaking havoc on the order, harmony, and happiness of all that is right and light and white. She must be contained, subjugated, and ultimately destroyed in order for the fantastic dream to work. And at first, when I noticed this many years ago, I thought, okay, I'm reading into this. But then, even a cursory examination of digital fandom proves that people aren't exactly happy with the presence of Black characters. So this is not unusual, and it still continues. So I'm very openly a member of Star Trek fandom, and there are a lot of people who are quite angry over the new iterations of this venerable old franchise. There are people who are furious that someone like Michael Burnham, is actually allowed to be a central character in a Star Trek in the 2020s. This problem of hesitation continues. This leads to my third principle. The dilemmatic presence of the dark other must be resolved with violence. Whether driven by desire, fear, longing, or some other impulse, darkness must be destroyed, or there's no story. Scholars of race, from Hazel Carby to Michelle Alexander, have noted the ways that the containment and destruction of Black bodies works in the real world. The fantastic is driven by similar imperatives at the symbolic level. Thus, the dark other is subjected to textual violence, which often, but not always, results in character death. Sometimes it's social death, as I point out in the, not the Vampire Diaries chapter, in the Merlin chapter. There was a social death there. Robin Bernstein's Racial Innocence quotes Thomas Jefferson's famous, treatise, Notes on the State of Virginia, 1781. Our third president and the author of the Declaration wrote that Negroes' griefs are transient, at stake in pain. And so that's, this idea that one of our founding fathers did not believe that Black people or people of African descent could feel the full range of human emotion is quite telling. And we see echoes of that to the present day. Andy, I think that you have a question.
I do have a question. Thank you. Thank you for noticing that. This also gives you a chance to take a pause.
Yes, breathe.
The audience chat has been just really mesmerizing so far. I really do appreciate everyone's thoughts. But this question comes from Kyle, actually a past TAC member. Kyle's in Louisville, Kentucky, and Kyle asks, Dr. Thomas, I'm wondering if you would be willing to talk about your perspective on N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth series. When the principles were applied to her work, what sorts of things can we see? And he thanks you for your talk.
Thank you so much, Kyle. I am so excited about Nora's trilogy. I think it is the best speculative fiction of the 21st century so far. Barring none. I mean, saving nothing else. I mean, she not only broke the dark fantastic cycle, she exploded it. I think that two things. First, I think that people tend to be drawn to, and not just, here I can't just even put this on white folks. I think that because we've all been carefully taught to read certain kinds of fantasy stories, those of us who are really into science fiction and family love that series. Many of us who loved Octavia Butler love that series and can't wait for the adaptation. But here are two observations. First, where is the fandom for the Broken Earth? There's a tiny fandom, but one of the things that I've talked with my creative friends, so Black authors and screenwriters and storytellers, is that, some of that is down to marketing. So we know that diverse stories in any format just don't usually receive the same marketing budget. But we find that audiences, if you use fan culture, and you can look at fan fiction, you can look at the number of posts on various fandom Reddits and other websites, I find that there's not quite as much engagement with diverse texts. And I think half of that is down to publishers, Hollywood corporations, and others really not marketing and merchandising those properties or those stories as much as they will other things. And I mean, some people have said, well, Ebony, wait. Yeah, let's wait and see. The other half of that is that Black feminist storytelling is its own universe, pocket universe, and it's a wonderful, wonderful universe. I need more of those adaptations to appear now. And here's why I'm worried. Octavia Butler's work is finally greenlit for some adaptation, but it's been decades. Why the decision to adapt B-list fantasy or B-list science fiction, and and not adapt Dawn, let alone Kindred or Parable of the Sower, the two of her books that are talked about. So I'm cautiously optimistic and very excited about N.K. Jemison's current and forthcoming work. So thanks for that question.
Thanks, Kyle, and thanks for that answer, Professor. Here's another question. This comes from Tisha, who's joining us from Connecticut tonight. Tisha asks, you mentioned, Professor, that you found the dark fantastic in literature by people of color. Did you find instances where that narrative was subverted? Was there anything that distinguished these narratives, where they appeared, how the subversion was approached, who wrote them, etc.? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, Tisha, thanks so much for the question. I think that the Broken Earth trilogy is but one example of ways that you can subvert the dark fantastic cycle and interrupt it. One of the things that I found most brilliant about Jemison's trilogy, but also in all of her work, she truly is doing a full world build where there aren't one-one correspondences between our world and the world she's created. So she is commenting on everything from climate change to social injustice to authority of various kinds. But she doesn't, make the people like us. They are she says that she has never told us that the stillness is planet Earth. And so without getting into the weeds of what happens in that trilogy, I think she does it. I think that certainly Octavia Butler did it with the parables, and with even more so in her Xenogenesis and Patternist series. But now I'm starting to get into the sci-fi weeds. One of the things I would love to see is for others to embrace Butler, Jemison. I haven't talked about Tananarive Due. I haven't talked about Nalo Hopkinson or Nnedi Okorafor. I would like to see those creatives to have the same wide audience as the creators of Star Wars, Star Trek, Game of Thrones, and all these other things. So a persistent problem is that everybody watches quote unquote mainstream speculative media, often written or created by white authors or screenwriters. But the reverse is just not true, is it? Right? So, if a Black writer is writing a Black story, it's assumed to be for Black people. If a Latinx author is writing for, Latinx people, it's just for them. I would like for us to have a storytelling environment where every story is for everyone, and folks are engaging with the story as enthusiastically as they would if the protagonists were just like them.
Thank you. It's my job as the moderator too to keep us on time. So
All right.
I'll that's okay. We have about 30 minutes left.
All right, great. The wonderful thing is I'm pretty much these are familiar, very familiar materials, so I can speed us through. So I was talking about haunting. And so I think that haunting is a good place to plunge back into this. So in traditional fantastic texts, the death tends not to be permanent. When the dark other is defeated and catharsis is reached, his or her present absence nonetheless haunts the story. And Toni Morrison refers to this haunting as romancing the shadow and playing in the dark. And I have some quotes here from it. Usually I just take some time and I just read through the quotes. But at this point, I think that Playing in the Dark is just a book. It's a classic text that I believe everyone should read. And I think it's quite teachable for my high school teacher colleagues. I am always going to be a high school teacher inside, wrapped up in this children's literature, professor shell. But I think it's an incredibly teachable book and a wonderful lens through which to read and teach and think about American literature. Although the dark other elicits both fear and desire, her continuing presence is necessary for the creation and sustaining of these playgrounds for the imagination, as Toni Morrison deems them. It is this dilemma that ultimately repositions the dark other as the spectacle that creates hesitation and elicits violence anew before haunting the rest of the story. Hence, the four principles of this cycle repeat, spawning sequels, spin-offs, and authorial success. I've been exploring this idea of the shadow book in my next academic book, which is a long ways away. I have to write it first. But I've been thinking about emancipation. I thought about calling this final principle liberation years ago, but I wanted to tie it specifically into the US and UK and also the Caribbean context. So thinking about the afterlife of race and the Black Atlantic. And I argue that it's only reached when the dark other is liberated from that cycle. And narratives with liberated dark others are rare, as I say in the book, and are rarely as popular as those that feature trapped dark subjectivities. This is because subverting the traditional position of dark others in the fantastic requires radical rethinking of everything that we've ever known or have been taught or read. I suspect there's been problems writing characters of color into these atypical roles because the principles are so unconsciously grained in our collective imagination that when this expected pattern is subverted, audiences simply cannot suspend disbelief. And again, I am sitting with that in a very real and visceral way in the evenings and weekends as an avid participant in Trek fandom. People are still not over there being a Black woman captain 3 seasons in. We're going into season 4 and people are still being really, really ugly on the fan boards about it. Critics, and I think it's not just, trolls on the internet or bots. I don't think it's just them because we also see, I'm just going to say it, behind the scenes, I've had a lot of conversations during 2020 about a lot of the recent Black speculative fiction, both on screen and on the page that's come out, not being very good. And I am offended. I've done some threads about it on Twitter. I threatened to start, writing a review column, which I have no time for. But the reason why is because people are just not used to these kinds of stories yet. I think we don't even know how quite to critique some of these stories that we're getting. People don't quite get it. They don't have anywhere. There's, I'm a reading professor. There's nowhere for them to sort of hang their hats in the schema, in the reader schema, right? They're not sure what to do with it. So readers and viewers complain that the protagonists are not likable. Critics observe that the characters' settings, circumstances, and resolutions are unbelievable or confusing. Agents say that the characters are not relatable Television and movie studios, as well as publishing houses, tell would-be authors that their stories are not marketable. Thus, dark others remain locked into place. The dark fantastic has entered the world. The theory has both been lauded and challenged, but that's the nature of knowledge. Things are not static, they're ever changing, and so we change with it. And it's the nature of scholarship to question one's own work. So I tend to be a person who was a reflective teacher when I was young. I was constantly agonizing, not just over planning, but over what I had just done in the classroom. I'm still like that. And so I'm going back and I'm questioning my own theory in some very real ways these days with the emergence of new texts.
Professor, I've got a question I'd like to insert here, if you don't mind. There's several queued up, and I'm going to save a couple of them for a little later on. But this one seems to fit this point in your talk. This is from Kate, who's joining us tonight from Arlington, Virginia. Kate asks if you see the slow change in the prevalence of, do you see slow change in the prevalence of emancipation? Her scholarship has found that traditional narrative patterns change frustratingly slowly. Are the stories out there, but they're just not achieving blockbuster status?
Hi, Dr. Kate. This is one of my wonderful colleagues, and you absolutely need to read Dr. Copy's book. I definitely would like to give a shout out there. Book on fairy tales, so you can look it up. I think that you're spot on. We absolutely. Starting to get a little feedback. I don't know what I just did. We absolutely have trouble finding, moving people away from traditional storytelling and toward more diverse science fiction and fantasy. I want to explore that more in research. I've been doing a lot with text over the past 7 years. I am hoping to get back into classrooms and into digital rooms as a researcher. So moving away from the books themselves, because that's coming around nicely. I see lots more diverse stories that we couldn't have dreamed of appearing everywhere. And so now it's time to turn toward readers and viewers and audiences. So I want to do a series of reader response studies to find out what people's prior experiences with reading these books were, or these shows or films, just, these stories were, and what their responses are to some of these diverse texts. And I want to, there's been some great colleagues who have worked looking at, for instance, Dr. Stephanie Tolliver's work is looking at Afrofuturism with Black girl readers and writers, and it's brilliant work. I want to know what others or people outside of cultures are thinking about, Afrofuturism or African futurism, because that's Nnedi Okorafor and others, Tochi Onyebuchi, Latinx futurism, indigenous futurism. So what does it mean to read these books from the outside? And I think that will help us get at how to expand the audience, how to get others to like those books. Not saying that readers shouldn't have choice, but kids and adults don't just need mirrors. The full theory from Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop was mirrors and windows and doors. And right now, there is one part of the audience that has just mirrors. So most of the books are mirrors, and they can just stay in mirror books. With those of us who are rejoicing over Black Panther, A Blade So Black, The Bells, and Children of Blood and Bone, people say, oh, you just want to read Black girl books. Well, for our entire lives, we've read everybody else's books too. We have a PhD in mainstream science fiction and fantasy and comics. We know that stuff like the backs of our hands. So we're finally getting mirrors. What would it take for others to experience our mirrors as windows and doors beyond the people who are going to seek it out anyway? So I know people in the audience are saying, well, I read, or my children read. Yes, we're part of a very specific community of educators, but what about the mass audiences? What will it do? How do we get the Latinx Game of Thrones, right? Like with an audience that broad. We need to know more about how the audience is moving. Okay. I'm going to just speed up so we can finish with questions and answers. You have this quote, two quotes from Xiaobo Xia, who wrote a piece that I talk about all the time. Anyone who knows me knows I love this chapter in Roderick McGillis's 1999 book, Voices of the Other, Children's Literature in the Postcolonial Context. And this just struck me that children's literature, and it's the very thing that Dr. Copy was talking about, if this is really the case, this landscape that she and I and many of us have laid out is the case, Dr. Sarah Parkdal and so many others, if this is the case, children are the most victimized because they're the most vulnerable to these narratives during their formative years. So they most urgently need to be post-colonized. And when I read that when I was 23 years old, I was first determined to create stories for my kids in Detroit. And then as a critic and a scholar and a professor, I have been passionate about decolonizing children's and young adult literature, especially in the realm of the imagination. I also recommend Zetta Elliott's Decolonizing the Imagination because she talks about this from a creative perspective. There have been many signs of change. I'm going to speed past these. And if Dr. Ansbach, Jennifer, if you could just post a link to Restoring the Self. This is just the terrain that I cover in the last chapter of the book. And I almost think in future talks, I can remove this slide because before 2020, it was a revelation that, wow, people are online and they're communicating more online than they are in person. But in 2020, really, everything here is redundancy. Everyone in this chat knows that this is the case. And you can see the dates. 2020 and the crisis we're living through has changed everything. So I'm going to skip forward, and you're more than welcome to please email me. I love to talk, as you can tell. And we can have a Zoom session and talk shop. Again, this is the other slide I told you I'll zoom right past, because before it was like digital intimacy, which was something that Dr. Kelly Sassi of North Dakota State University and we talked about in 2011, that, wow, look at the kids online and with these new fangled smartphones, they are, engaging in digital intimacy, which is not necessarily prurient or anything like that, but it's like, we use the internet to connect in ways that are far more amplified than in person. But again, after the past 2 years, I really need to take these two slides out of my talk. And colleagues, I just ask for your forgiveness because it's like everyone just said, this is, we're all living through all of this. But I want to draw your attention to my last statement here with colleague Amy Storni-Ayuolo at Penn. Digital intimacy creates space for disjunctures. We're living through that right now, but also possibilities, particularly as people engage in transgressive, collaborative reading that position them at the center of their own literate worlds. And so this is the good news. So the dark fantastic's the bad news, and restoring work with Amy is good news. In the past, engagement in the world of story required that all people who were marginalized and minoritized needed to adhere to dominant notions of who got to be in the center of narratives, discourse, in the world. I would argue that predates our modern tragedies of colonialism and settler colonialism, enslavement. Even, if we were to put you in a time machine and go back 1,000 years or several thousand years, yes, people who are more dominant in that culture control narrative. Today, there are new possibilities. And I talk in the article about Hamilton, And there was a line from Hamilton in the very last act, at the end of the show, where Eliza Hamilton, played magnificently by Philippa Sue, sings, "I put myself back into the narrative." And Hamilton itself is an example that has been very controversial, and rightfully so, because Chernall's biography of that founder has been contested by historians and colleagues such as Dr. Lynn Montero have written critiques of Hamilton as, like, what does it do when people of color portray the very architects of our current condition? However, agreeing with all of those critiques, what I thought was really interesting and really powerful is the way that young people really took to Hamilton and they created a fandom. So Hamilton is a restory of a restory. So it's this really interesting telephone, so to speak, that's going on with the story of, a man who's on our money. And I find that very fascinating, Of course, taking ownership of story is important. I'm going to speed past this slide with apologies to my trans and non-binary colleagues, because this particular author has been involved in some recent controversies. The point of the slide, which was from a couple of years ago, is thinking about the idea of taking ownership of story. We certainly see that with young creatives of today who, sharpen their storytelling pens online in fan communities, gaming communities, and in other spaces on the web. So, of course, I've thought a lot about this idea of bending. And ways that first Black girls' agentive readings of Hermione as Black, might have been a decision that led to her actually appearing as Black in officially licensed storytelling, Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. And again, there are some revisions that, as I'm reconsidering my work, because as I mentioned, the previous author, the author of this series, has also been entangled in controversy. And I want to apologize and to note that to all of our colleagues. And I completely condemn those who would create for children and for people from the margins and not be inclusive of everyone. I've noted young people from around the world engaged in various kinds of bending in digital storytelling. And I talk in that article about Jessica Popescu, who lives in Romania, who I chatted with in fandom, who race bent Varda. So it's not just children of color who are race bending, not just kids who are LGBTQ who are writing slash or queer bending in these fan spaces. Everybody is engaged in all kinds of imaginative play, not without problems or issues. So one of my younger reviewers rightly noted that I was not critical enough of this, of the dangers inherent in the fan landscape, because all of the oppressions of the real world exist not only in the stories I talked about in the Dark Fantastic, but also in these communities. But here is an example of a young woman living in Eastern Europe whose imagination was fired up by Storm in Marvel Comics. That's what she told me. She read Storm, and so of course when she read the Silmarillion, she saw Varda as a Black woman who looked like Storm and whose hair, instead of being white, was midnight with stars. And I just think that's so beautiful. Coming to the end, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. The phenomenon of bending is not just a matter of fan art and fan fiction. I believe it has implications for the phenomenology of reading, what young people imagine as they make sense of stories as written on the page or as they appear on the screen. As Jennifer Barnes notes, there's evidence to support the idea that readers contribute imaginatively to fictional stories that they consume. Prior research has shown that readers project a gender onto characters that, where if the gender is not specified, import real-world facts into fictional worlds and misremember the details of a story to make it more congruent with their own experiences. Different readers experience the same text differently, just as two actors might have a different interpretation of the same role. If readers are bending characters, plots, and settings in order to identify with stories, then arguments about authorial intent must be reconsidered in both literary pedagogy and in reading assessment. Increasingly, young people are looking for mirrors, windows, and doors not only into others' experiences, but also to see their own experiences and their own faces to be represented in media. And here I'll stop and show you, this all the different forms of restoring that Amy and I have observed in young people's digital composings. It's definitely my most cited article and piece altogether. And we have been chatting with folks all over the world who are documenting some of these practices. Restoring the imagination opens up new worlds, has the power to disrupt singular meta-narratives. It forces others to confront the metaphors that they read by, so sort of these ideas that we bring into our reading, and has the potential to close the imagination gap. I think that this is a good way that we might be able to reconcile the crisis of race and the imagination. All worlds are possible, and so are all protagonists. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I wanted to close by showing you some of the amazing stories, just a fraction of the amazing stories that have appeared for young readers, young Black readers in particular, but across diversities. We're just starting to get these wonderful, incredible stories beyond our wildest dreams, pure imagination, liberated, endarkened, and made whole. Thank you so much for being here this evening. All right. Did I lose everybody? Uh-oh. Oh, thank you. Andy, have we lost you?
I'm sorry, you actually did. I was muted because I was trying to reduce the feedback. Let me start over. Take two, and that is to say thank you so much again, Professor Thomas, for sharing your thoughts. I'm going to encourage, we have plenty of time for questions, and we have some queued up. I do want to encourage the audience to note the Ask Professor Thomas tab. You can submit a formal question. As the moderator, I'll bring it forward. And I'm going to start with Debbie. Debbie is joining us tonight from southeastern Massachusetts. And Debbie asks, Dr. Thomas, what would be a more satisfying alternative to death for the main character?
Transformation. Let's have the main character at the end of this science fiction or fantasy narrative, absolutely be transcended and transformative. So that's not like sort of the happily ever afters that we grew up with, right? So it's different. A transcendent ending is like the ending of the Broken Earth trilogy, where you're just, I threw my book around. Okay, I didn't throw my book across the room. I can be dramatic, but it was so good. I immediately gushed for hours to one of my professor colleagues, Dr. Kenitra Brooks. And I said, oh my God, I finally finished it. Oh my God. So I don't want to ruin it for you, but that is just one of the most satisfying endings of a tale that I've ever experienced. I would say the same thing with most of our new trilogies or most of our new duologies that we're getting from authors in the middle grades and YA space are in progress. But we've had the end of Danielle Clayton's The Bells duology pictured here. I would invite you to read that. We have the Shadow Shaper trilogy. I feel as if authors of today are figuring out how not to leave their character just ground into the dust. And I think that prior to the Afrofuturistic Renaissance in youth and young adult literature, what I was noticing and what I noted in that article I told you about was that I think the only kinds of books that got greenlit before that tended to, like there was this propensity to kill at least one of the characters of color or queer characters in the ensemble. We saw it as late as the 100 when you think about lesbian characters, teen characters on screen in the 100. That was just, that happened in 2016, I want to say. So up until the end of the 2010s, we were getting a lot of death. And I'm so glad that we're starting to see less of that in storytelling. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. The next question comes from Scott. Scott is our resident librarian. He's a past TAC member for the center and a librarian in Knoxville, Tennessee. Scott asks, Dr. Thomas, could you please address the dark fantastic in relation to urban fantasy, a genre that's currently popular in YA publishing?
Yes, I am so thrilled that urban fantasy is hot right now. I read it avidly. I'm trying to write one, and I am, so thrilled. I feel as if the dark fantastic cycle works a little differently vis-a-vis urban texts because you have the blend of the contemporary world and then the portal quest either into a fantastic world or into a gaming world, as in the case of Slay, Brittany Morris's wonderful book, or you have, but for instance, I think L.L. McKinney subverts it in A Blade So Black and sort of that blended Alice in Wonderland and Buffy retelling. I mean, it's lovely, and so I do think that we have these authors and these screenwriters who are fighting, but they have to fight. And thank God, so many of them have been so inspirational because they're not only having to carve out space to be creatives in an industry where they're marginalized, but they're also leading, they have to almost dynamite out the space in order to do this kind of subversion. So, L.L. McKinney and Tochi Onyebuchi, and I believe there was one other of the authors, came up with the publishing paid me hashtag to reveal disparities in publishing. And they are amazing and incredible, but it's almost as if, Black creatives and other creatives of color and indigenous creatives have to become activists in addition to carving out space for their creative work. And that's a lot. It would be great if they could use that, like if the landscape was more equal and decolonized, and they could give us even more stories, we could get even more adaptations, although they're all doing extremely well and writing across modes. And so I'm just super thrilled. So thank you so much for that, Scott.
Here's a question for you, Professor. Just a few nights ago, this past Tuesday, in fact, we had a webinar with Ari Kelman, who's an historian at UC Davis and helped write a graphic novel of the Civil War. Talk to us a little bit about graphic novels. Do you see the same kinds of dark fantastic cycle in both the content, the text, and the visuals, the artistry?
I actually don't study graphic novels as well as I should. I teach a really popular course at GSE on picture books, comics, and graphic novels, where we think about visual literacies and reading in the visual. But I will defer to my colleagues who study, and some may be in the audience, who are experts and actually creators of and graphic novels. I think that the underground and independent comic scene is one that continues to be vibrant it's where all the most interesting stuff is right now. And so you almost have to go to the comic cons. I started getting into comic conventions or comic cons several years ago through one of my former students, Dr. David Lowe, Cal State Fresno. He took me and a bunch of students to ECBAC, which is the East Coast Black Age of Comics Convention, and in 2013. And that was the first time I'd gone to a non-fantasy specific or fandom specific convention. And since then, I have been eagerly seeking out smaller cons to go to, and I document them on my Instagram. I also try to seek out independent creators at New York and San Diego Comic Cons. Because those are the folks who are keeping the art form going, and I think that's another area where they've completely exploded any and all dark fantastic cycles. Just getting their work out there and into the hands of readers, I think, is a challenge in a landscape where Marvel and DC and really Marvel and DC, because IDW, Dark Horse, and others aren't nearly as big. They've kind of eaten the landscape. Like the Marvel Cinematic Universe was the best and worst thing that ever happened to comics. But again, I'm just a fan there and not a scholar. My realm is definitely children's and young adult.
Thank you. We have time for just a couple of more questions. This one comes from Karen, who's joining us from Kansas. Karen asks, feel free to comment some on the recent holiday musical Jingle Jangle.
Wonderful. Hi, Karen. Dr. Westman is a mentor of mine. She and her partner, Phil Nell, were the people who I always talk about my origin story. They're the ones who told me it was possible to be a children's literature professor. I'd never thought of such a thing. And she, I adored Jingle Jangle. I have watched it several times. I have, looked for fanfic on it because I'm just like, the young Geronicus. I'm just really, really intrigued by it. But that screenwriter had such a journey trying to get that made, and I'm grateful we have it. I wish I'd had it when I was a little girl, but I'm glad that my nieces and nephews, nibblings, have that.
Fantastic. Professor, here's the last question for the night. And I'd like you to sort of interpret this question at your own free will, however you'd like to hear this. Hey, Professor, are you optimistic?
Wow. Oh, that's a good question. Thanks for whoever.
No, that's my question. That's my final question. This is from Andy in Chapel Hill. Andy in Chapel Hill wants to know, are you optimistic?
Oh, man. Okay. Yes. I mean, I just have to say yes. I've become a crank and a pessimist. I was always optimistic and starry-eyed and the classic squeeing fangirl up until a few years ago, where I very, loudly and publicly, got very discouraged. But when I believe in these young people who are creating new books and new media, I believe in the not so young people who are finally getting their voices heard after all these decades of marginalization and struggle and the fight. I believe that we can be better than we are. And maybe it's a naive and foolish hope, but I think that we absolutely have to be better than we are now, because there has to be more than this. And if we can just change the stories that we believe, if we can just change the stories that we believe about ourselves and about each other and what is possible collectively as humans, I think that we could leave those coming after us a much better world. I know we can do it, and I hope to see that change, or that bend, as I say at the end of Restoring the Self, this decade, within the next 10, 20 years. I hope we see that, see the arc of the moral universe bend.
Perhaps